coming. This is the May monthly update that we do each month. And so to remind you, I try to catch us up on what some of the major economic developments of the last month were, and then go into one or two topics at a little bit more depth to help all of you understand what's going on and then be able to translate it into explanations for your friends and relatives and co-workers, and also to translate it into action, which I hope you can see is badly needed to change things in the society. Okay, so let me start with some of the shorter items and work my way up to some of the longer and somewhat more complicated ones. Probably the biggest ongoing economic story over the last month, as in previous months, has been this peculiar phenomena, which, depending on your point of view, is either called a wonderful economic recovery, that's the mainstream and the political folks, or for the economists, a mystery, because so much of the economy isn't recovering, or for some of us, it's a peculiar way that a capitalist system handles its economic cycles or crises or oscillations. So let me describe it for you. First, to make sure you're happy for this evening, the good news. And the good news is that corporate profits have done pretty well. They're not scheduled to do real well for the rest of this year, but up until this year, the last several years, they've gone up. So have corporate prices for the goods that they sell. So have corporate stock shares. The stock market is reaching new highs over the last 4 or 5 months, maybe a little bit longer. And so some people, namely those that are in the world of high finance and top of the corporate heap, and people who have significant amounts of stocks and bonds, well, not bonds, stocks, have done well. And they have recovered much of the territory lost in the downturns of 2008 and 2009. And that's significant. Those people, those wealthy people, are doing very well. If you look at where they shop, those stores are doing very well. And if you look at folks who have lots of shares, or even people who don't have lots of shares but are looking at their 401ks, if they've got them invested in shares, they're looking a little bit better than they did 2 or 3 years ago. There's no question about that. That is a recovery. It's a recovery for folks pretty much at the top of the economic heap. And that's consistent with the fact that they did the best before the crisis. They did the best during the crisis. They got the lion's share of the bailout money. And so it isn't really all that surprising that they've recovered pretty well. Be careful about the numbers. For example, you hear all the time the stock market has gotten back to the 1,400, 1,500, the Dow Jones Industrial Average and so on, that it peaked at before the crisis. That's not the way economists do that. They have to adjust for the change in the price of everything. It doesn't really matter that your stocks are back to the price they were 8 years ago or 6 years ago, because the prices of everything else have gone up since then, so it's not worth the same. So what economists do is they adjust the price to take it, the price of stocks and the stock market averages, to take account of the overall price level. When you do that, we haven't got back to where we were in 2007. We still have quite a ways to go. So if you adjust, you can see even the recovery isn't as robust as they would like us to believe. But now let's turn to the other part of the story, which is basically the condition of most of the 80 or 85% of the people who either aren't at the top of the corporate heap or who do not own significant amounts of stock. If you aren't an executive, if you aren't fairly high in a company, and if you don't own significant amounts of stock, this recovery has passed you by. You're not participating. And that's where the most Americans are. And trying to come up with a image that I could leave you with that drives the point home, the one I found most useful, if I can get this far, is actually that table at the upper right-hand corner of the board here, the little graph.
Wheel it up a
Can you see it now better? Okay, what you want to see is look at this line. This measures U.S. median income, and we adjust every year for the prices of that year. So it gives you an idea of how much people can afford to buy. Median means 50% of Americans are better off than that, and 50% are worse off. Median, not the average, the median, okay? So it was around $56,000 for an average American family. 56,000, bounced around from the year 2000 to the year 2009. Then it dropped like a stone from 56,000 to around 51,000, or a drop of 10%, which is huge for the country as a whole, because this takes in all families. And notice what has happened since. Nothing. There's no recovery. Nothing has turned up. It's bounced around, and in fact, the last number's dipping down again. So for the vast mass of the American people, which this graph pretty well shows you, their situation is down during the worst years, 2008, 2009, and then no recovery at all. One other way to see it is with the unemployment numbers. Unemployment before the crisis hit, 2007, was around 4.8%, official number of the government. It then zoomed up in 2009, 2010 to 10%, more than doubling. It is now around 7.5%. Okay? However you do that, 7.5% is not even halfway back to where things were before the crisis hit in 2007. So there's no recovery in the sense of getting back even to where we were. And 4.7 or 4.8% in 2007 was no great shakes to begin with. That's millions of people without work. But we're not even halfway back. And it's worse than that because the jobs that have been gotten since the crisis are systematically much worse jobs than those that were lost. Skilled workers have taken a tremendous hit. They've either had to accept much lower wages or they've been replaced by people who accept much lower wages. The benefits that go with the jobs have been reduced, and the security of the jobs has been reduced. So yes, we've gotten halfway back from the level of unemployment we had before the crisis hit, but only by taking the kinds of jobs that are much inferior to what you had. Final example of this. The best place to be to get a job in America in the last 3 years has been working for a temp agency. If you look in the stock market, you will see things like Kelly. Remember, it used to be called, I think, Kelly Girl, that it became Kelly Labor Services or whatever it's called. Temp jobs are the big growth industry in employment. They account for half of the recovery we have. And those jobs all have one key quality: no benefits, or virtually no benefits. That is why employers are shifting from regular employees to whom they have to give a medical program, maybe even a pension program and all of that, to having what are called contract workers, people who work on a stipulated contract, sometimes for a week or a month or something like that, because those people don't have to get benefits. And one of the horrible ironies of the new Obamacare medical program is you must do things for people that you employ regularly that you are not required to do if you have a contracted temp worker doing them instead. So one of the reasons companies are shifting from regular employees to temps is because they can get out of the medical coverage they would otherwise have to give them, thereby plunging more and more Americans into the situation they're in of not having the kinds of benefits that their parents' generation did. Bottom line, we have a split schizoid economy. Part of it at the top, the part of it that needed it least has done the best. And the mass of people who needed it most have done the worst. And that is nicely shown by this diagram. So when you hear recovery, it's not that it's false, it's that it's true, but for a very small top sliver of the society, and leaves everybody else not only without a recovery, but in the peculiar American way of making it a personal issue, feeling bad that the reason they're not participating in the recovery they hear about is because there's something wrong with them. They blame themselves, even though it's the majority phenomena for everybody that has nothing to do with this or that individual, has to do with the structure of the economy that simply does not provide a way out of that situation. The second issue that you may not have read about because it didn't get anything like the level of publicity that the recovery has to do with a growing problem that at least those of you that are young know about. This has to do with the cost of higher education. Like in many things in America, we have a higher version, and we carefully avoid calling anything lower. So we do not have a lower education system. We have a education system and then a higher one. It's like eggs start at large. You don't get little eggs. You can't find that. Some of you can find, if you look a long time, at a medium egg, which turns out to be the littlest you can get. It's sort of like the middle class. You know, we're the middle. That makes us not feel like we're what we are. So all eggs, however small, are middle-size eggs. Medium, I believe, is the word they like. Anyway, public higher education. Public, as in the government runs it. And again, just to remind you, if you're not familiar with the numbers, depending on how you count, we have 15, 16 million full-time people who go to colleges and universities. If you count a lot of vocational and other kinds of institutions, it gets up to 20 million. But let's use the 16 million number as a pretty good approximation for college and university students in the United States now. Out of that, a clear 3/4 go to public higher education. Private education is for the minority in the United States. The overwhelming majority of people go to public schools, schools run by states. In the main in this country, the states have that responsibility. Okay, and there's been a drastic change in the financing of public higher education in the United States, and here's what I mean. If you go back to the 1980s, actually the late 1980s, the general proportion of how we as a society paid for public higher education, that is, the college and university educations that the majority of people going to college or university could go to, public school, it was an 80-20 split. That is, the government paid about 80% of the cost of the education, and the student, his or her individual his or her person or his or her family, paid the other 20%, an 80-20 split. And remember, after World War II, which is when public universities really became important in America on a mass scale, the whole point of developing higher education publicly was because the mass of Americans couldn't possibly afford to go to a private university or college. Those were really institutions for the rich. That's how they began, that's how they developed, and that's what they were. And when you got a mass demand of the American working class coming out of the Great Depression, the war, and all that had represented, there was a tremendous push from below of the American working class to have something that they had always associated with upper income people, with employers, namely a college education for your children. That was a sign that you were moving up in the world if you could provide that for your kids. So the mass of Americans wanted it, but there were two problems. One, they couldn't afford to go to a private school. It was too expensive. And number two, there weren't enough places. Private schools were small. They were designed for the elite in the country. They had served the elite very nicely throughout the history of the United States, and they weren't about to become big schools. They didn't want to. So the only solution was public higher education. The state, the federal government, and the state governments could produce institutions that would be large. That's why if you go to the average campus of a state university in this country, it's big. It has many more students than most private schools ever had. Thousands, tens of thousands. And cheap, much cheaper than private school because the government paid a huge share. Just a footnote. For those of you who listen too much to conservative economists and politicians who like to have you believe that what's creative about the United States is the private sector, and what is terribly burdensome and wasteful is the public sector. The only reason the mass of Americans who are educated have good jobs is because they have college and university educations, and the overwhelming majority of them got that thanks to the government, without which they couldn't have gotten it. So it's important to forget that in order to believe the ideology that the government somehow is a big fat burden and we would all be better off if we got the government off our backs. Strange argument, have no basis in the realities of our situation, but if you repeat it often enough and people are not given an alternative understanding, it flies. You know that because the majority of people in Congress think and talk like that. So something, they either fell on their head or they had a very bad education, probably in one of those private schools. In any case, it was a ratio of 80 to 20. Now, what is it in 2013? The ratio is now 50-50. It's very important that you understand that. The states have cut back drastically the amount of money they provide to public higher education. You see that here in New York, you see it in all the 50 states. And the only way to make that up is to take more money from the individual student. Part of the problem is solved also by cutting back the number of programs, laying off teachers, having bigger classes. There's little economies you can do that way, but they were never enough. The bottom line is make the mass of American working people, for whom higher public education was created, foot more and more of the bill. Literally reverse what was done after World War II and put the mass of people more and more into the situation of facing an education they cannot afford. That's what this is doing. How has the American working class reacted to this? And while it was getting bad already from the 1980s, it has gotten markedly worse in the last 5 years because the crisis has limited the money available in state and federal government, so they in turn have cut back on what was already a shrinking budget for higher education. What did the American working class do faced with this erosion of something that was part of the American dream that every parent hoped to give to his or her kids as a way to step up in the world compared to your own parents, because you would get an education and you could afford it? What happens when you make it impossible to afford it? Several things. First, Americans have changed their minds. A significant number of Americans are choosing not to go to the university because they literally can't afford it. So that is already happening, and the statistics are there to show it. But most Americans didn't go that route. Most Americans did not want to give up the dream, the advance, the college education, and the life they thought that would bring them if they went and they did it. So how could they do it if it was more and more expensive? And remember, since the 1980s, the average real wage of the American working class, flat. So how are you going to afford to pay more and more of the college education when you're flat? Solution, you borrow. The American solution to all of these problems in the last 30 years has been to borrow. It began by borrowing against the only thing you could borrow with, if you were an American, your house, because it was the only collateral you had to offer to a lender. So you began to have, already in the 70s and 80s, the growing phenomena of American families borrowing against their house to finance their kids going to school, to pay it that way, right? Then that wasn't enough. And so the Banks of America obliged by making loans available for students, a direct student loan. Now, the student didn't have to have any collateral. That is, the student didn't have to offer anything the way the parents had to with their house. So how did the banks become willing to lend to students who had no collateral by making sure that the law in the country treated student debts different from every other kind of debt. If you have a house, a mortgage, you borrow for a house, the law says if you can't pay anymore, the bank takes the house. That's its protection against your defaulting on the loan. And if you default on other kinds of loans, there are procedures that the bank can take against you. Garnishing your pay, going after your assets. But you have a protection there a little bit. You can declare bankruptcy, and you can get out of it. But the law about student loans, for those of you who don't know, is very special in America. It's the one kind of credit which bankruptcy cannot be used to get you out of. So if you're a student with debt, you're going to have it forever. You cannot undo it. Well, of course, you cannot undo it unless and until students make the kind of trouble in the society that gets these laws changed. But we're not going to discuss that because that's a little scary. So I'll just leave it with you as a thought. However, I'm an economist, so I can avoid these dicey political problems by just focusing on what the economics are. Over the last 20 years, two things have happened that really put the crunch on students. One, they've borrowed more and more money as the cost of a higher education becomes more and more the problem of the individual. And in the crisis of the last 6 years, the families of all these students are less and less able to come up with the money because they have their own financial problems. They're unemployed. They have someone in the family who's unemployed. They're unable to sustain their mortgage payments. They got enough grief. So the student has to borrow even more because the parents and the relatives can't help. So the debt level of students has zoomed. At the same time, because of movement of jobs out of the country, because of the crisis that makes many jobs disappear, the prospects of a person with a college education are much poorer than they used to be. Your chances of getting a job are much poorer, and your chances of earning any kind of money with the job you get are lousy. Well, then you're caught in a scissors movement. You have more and more debts to get the degree, which gives you less and less means to pay off the debt you had to incur to get the degree, because it's not going to deliver to you what you had hoped and what you had been led to expect. That's producing in the United States an extraordinary and dangerous economic phenomena. Namely, we now have over $1 trillion worth of outstanding student debt. Just so you know, the student debt of the United States, taken together, is larger than the total credit card debt in the United States, taken together. Over the last 20 years, credit cards, which were much more important than student loans, have grown much less quickly than student loans, to the point where last year, student loans for the first time in total passed in their size. That makes them enormous. And one of the greatest fears at the Federal Reserve, that's the institution in Washington in charge of our financial system, is the fear of a collapse of student loans. Last point then is why? As with every other kind of loan, over the last 30 years in the United States, a new kind of stock was invented for the stock market. I've explained this in the past, but again, some of you are new. Let me do it quickly again. It used to be the stock was a piece of paper you bought in the stock market, and it gave you a piece of the company that made something. So if you bought General Motors stock, you had a piece of what makes Chevrolets, and if you bought the DuPont, you had a piece of what makes nylon, and so on. Starting about 30 years, a new kind of stock developed. You would buy it, but you weren't buying a piece of a company that made something. You were buying a piece of a collection of debts. You would buy a piece of paper, and it literally gave you a piece of, say, 100 mortgages. A bank would have taken 100 people's mortgage, Mrs. Smith and Mr. Jones and whoever, 100 folks, and put them together in a little bundle, And those people, of course, had to do what all mortgage borrowers do, had to make a monthly payment to some bank somewhere to pay off their house over 15 or 20 years. And you bought a piece of paper that entitled you to a piece of what all those 100 families were paying into the bank. You got a piece of their debt. Well, that's been done with student loans. So let me explain to many of you, if you know somebody who has a student loan, he or she thinks that every month they give some money to their bank to pay off their student loan. Yes, you do that, but the bank is just a handler. All that bank does is turn around, send that money to some place, and it ends up in the pocket of the people who bought the shares of those debts. So around the world, wealthy people own you as a student paying your debts. So far, so good. But if the American student body has accumulated debts that it can never pay because it can't possibly get a job at an income that will allow them to do it, then at a certain point there's a risk that investors around the world will panic, owning shares in the debts that will not get paid. Some of you may recognize what I'm describing because in the year 2008, that was called the subprime mortgage crisis. The American economy collapsed when millions of Americans basically couldn't pay their monthly mortgage. And the fear in Washington is we're facing a situation in which the mass of students may begin to explain to the world that they can't. By the way, the rate of student default now on existing student loans is much higher than the default rate on mortgages, on credit cards, or anything else. There's already all the evidence we need that students are literally walking away from their debts, and that's a serious economic and social problem that is becoming more and more frightening in Washington as they contemplate where that may go. The next item I want to talk about is also something that happened in the last month, and it started on the 24th of April. On the 24th of April, a building in Dhaka, Bangladesh, collapsed. And in the early hours after this collapse, two things were made clear. It was very bad. The initial number, I believe, was 73 people killed and another 100 or 200 wounded, considerable number missing. And it turned out that the second piece of interesting information was that this building wasn't a residence. This was a building that had clothing shops, clothing factories, they're called. In this country, we used to call them sweatshops. And that wasn't a kind of description. It was a description of what you experienced when you worked in there. Okay, well, here we are, 3 or 4 weeks later, and what do we know? The latest death count, official death count of the Bangladeshi government is 1,127 dead people, making it one of the worst industrial tragedies, accidents, whatever word you want, imaginable. Sorry. Doomed by modern technology. $1,127 dead people in these clothing factories. And I don't know what the count is of injured or lost people, but it is a staggering catastrophe. And it's interesting how it evolved. It took day after day before slowly the figures were moved up from the original 73 to 1,000. I mean, it's quite a distance there. And they were added to every day. Then we saw pictures of the arrest of the man whose company built the building and a dispute between him and the engineer as to who was to blame for making a building that was obviously incapable. And then the people inside the building claimed that they wanted to shut it, but the clothing manufacturers who had their businesses in there didn't want to lose a day's work, and on and on and on, the usual finger pointing to get out of the blame. I noticed yesterday and today a new headline, and that is that the big companies around the world, which include many that you're familiar with, the chain, I believe it's H&M, is a major buyer of this stuff. So you really are dealing here with inexpensive clothing that drips the blood of the people lost in the process of producing it. Over the last 2 days, have been a flurry by the companies involved and by the government in Bangladesh. The amount of bad publicity, which initially they were obviously willing to absorb, first day, first week, first 2 weeks, with the increase in the attention around the world, the endless drumbeat each day of hundreds of more dead bodies, particularly young people who were working in there, it became impossible. So we've had a flurry in the last 2 days, companies announcing, like H&M, that they are now going to be very strict in their rules about the conditions under which the workers work who produce their clothing. And if you take that seriously, then I will have an opportunity for you after the meeting to purchase a large portion of the Brooklyn Bridge for $11. So if you're interested, come and see me. That has the same chance of working out as these assurances by these companies that they're not going to do what they have made their money on doing for 30 years. Number one. Number two, the government of Bangladesh, looking to all the world to be what it is, has had to make a change. And they've taken 2 drastic steps. And I'm going to tell you what they are because it gives you an idea of what the conditions there were. Number one, they're going to raise the minimum wage. What is the minimum wage for a clothing worker in Dhaka, Bangladesh now? $38 a month, US dollars. Okay? Now, you can make all kinds of adjustments, but that makes you, to use a technical economics term, piss poor. You got nothing. And now you don't have your life either. Okay? And the government is going to raise it. I think if we hold our breath, might even push over $40 a month. And the second thing they're going to allow, this is really daring, government announced, trade unions. Before this, the law in Bangladesh was you could only form a labor union in a factory, ready? If you got the employer's permission. That was the law. And that law, we've been told yesterday, is going to be changed. Unions are going to be allowed to try to organize workers without prior permission from the employer. You really have to take your hat off. A hat probably made in Bangladesh in order to appreciate the breakthrough that has been accomplished. And it only cost 1,127 people dead. What is all this about? And that's the important thing, because none of these things are going to be significantly changed. As soon as these headlines are no longer there, we will go right back to where we were. And the same conditions exist in many, 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 many other countries. So Bangladesh is just an illustration where the disaster exposes. And so it's a chance for us to say something about it. So here's the story. Over the last 100 to 150 years, in the United States, Western Europe, and Japan, there have been 150 years of active struggle between capitalist employers and workers, who, by the way, had to fight for the right to organize a union, etc., etc. And over the last 150 years, for all kinds of complicated reasons, the wages in the United States, Western Europe, and Japan were slowly pushed up, creating the standards of living and the working class conditions that we're familiar with and that many of us have lived. The problem with a capitalist system has always been, and can be summarized this way: the more successful workers are in achieving a decent income and standard of living, the greater the incentive they give to the employer to take the job away. In other words, whenever you win something in a capitalist system as a worker, you have to understand, or else you're going to make a terrible mistake, that the very victory you've won creates an extraordinary vulnerability for you to live with. You win, but in the act of winning, you lose. And if you don't change the system, there's no way out of that. So here, let's see, because this takes you right to Bangladesh. One of the big industries of Europe, Japan, and the United States over the last 150 years was the clothing industry. And that's for a simple reason: we all use it. Because it's cold and because we don't want people to see what we look like if we don't. So we have clothing. And if we're Americans, we have an enormous amount of it. Stuffed into the bureaus and we buy clothing. So it's been a big industry making the clothing for which there's such a bumbling market. But as the wages get bid up, in all industries, including clothing industries, the following idea dawns in the minds of the capitalists. We're making a bundle, we're making clothing, but we're being pressured by all kinds of social developments over 150 years to pay these workers something. And then we got to pay them a little more, and we can do it because we're making so much money. But you know, we're being approached by people who come from, I don't know, Bangladesh. I look it up. I discover I don't know how to spell it. I ask people who know. They give me the right spelling. I find it. It is very far away. But I do a little arithmetic, the kind that you learn in your Master of Business Administration program. We call it adding. They call it higher math. And you add up. And it turns out that for $38 a month, you could afford to make the clothing over there and ship it back to the United States to sell it, and you'd still be ahead because the cost of shipping it isn't anywhere near as much as you'll save by going from, I don't know, $10 or $20 an hour to $38 a month. So guess what happens? The clothing factories of the United States, Western Europe, and Japan leave. They close down. They're done. Some of you travel to parts of New England, and you will see some of the towns, places like Worcester, Framingham in Massachusetts, if you know them, Concord, New Hampshire, all kinds of places. You'll see these long brick buildings, 3-4 stories high, red brick buildings, very rectangular. Those are all clothing factories that were once the center of a clothing industry here in the United States. They are now abandoned, or they're the places where you have in one building 37 yoga studios, 6 art galleries, and more ice cream than an entire population could consume, right? Because they have to fill it with something, and there's no industry left that wants to be there. Because what happened with clothing happened to all the other industries. They're gone. And they went for a simple reason, and only one. Capitalists could make more money doing it there than doing it here. On the 4th of July, those capitalists beat their breasts about their patriotism. They have to fly back from Bangladesh to make the meeting, but they're there. They stay 6, 7, maybe even 8 hours, and fly back to where their heart and their wallets are, over there, and they make a fortune doing it. But the whole name of the game is to get the clothing cheap. And the competition means that the Americans are doing it, but the French are doing it, the Italians are doing it, the Norwegians are doing it, the Japanese are doing it, and they're all competing with each other to try to be the lowest cost producer of this clothing. And they develop whole new ways in the United States to market that cheap clothing, because you can't use the old mechanisms. People don't want that kind of cheap clothing. It doesn't work. That's why Sears Roebuck is over. and Wanamaker is over, and Montgomery Ward is over. Those were all the places where people used to shop in this country. Instead, we have, Walmart, Target, H&M, C&A, P&Q, and all the others, right? People who have the skill of developing the notion, here it is, cheaper than you ever dreamed of, and loads of it. There must be room in your closet for 12 more T-shirts. And so the competition becomes fierce. And you have to be the one who wins that struggle. So if you can cut a corner by using a building that was not made properly and the owner kind of knows it and is afraid and so will cut you a deal, you go right in there. Here's the irony of it all. When capitalism got going, say in England in the 18th and 19th century, it produced horrible conditions for people, paid them horrible wages. They lived in horrible slums. You know how we know that? Because we all read, I hope we all did, the novels of Charles Dickens, because that's what he wrote about. He described how in London people, but the descriptions of Charles Dickens are absolutely spot on for Dhaka, Bangladesh. So here's the irony. We live in the 21st century of modern capitalism, and the success is rendered by the fact that the bulk of the working men and women producing for 21st century capitalism are living in 19th century conditions in third world countries around the world. And you know what was a typical feature of 19th century British workshops? If you read Dickens, fires. Fires, because they're all old wooden structures, and they couldn't cope with the risks and the dangers of machine production, so they had fires in which working men and women died in huge numbers. The exact same. It's as if, not that capitalism has changed, it hasn't. What's changed is the idea in the minds of Americans particularly that we don't have a system that works that way, even though it's been working that way for 200 years, 300 years. Last point about this, and here's the political punch of it. Capitalism from 1820 to 1970 did good in the United States. It was so profitable, it was so successful, that it could bring more and more immigrants, wave after wave of them, here, and give them a job. And the job had high wages, and the wages went up. And Americans got that idea that they lived in a charmed place, a place where every generation lives better than the one before, where your incomes will go up. It's just, man, if you were religious, and remember the United States was founded by people for whom religion was an important matter, if you were religious, you really believed that God liked us best. Because look what he was providing. No other working class had this. It's true. No other working class had 150 years of rising wages. Capitalism and prosperity. Capitalism delivers the goods. And it did. Now, it's true, if you paid some attention, you might have noticed that it did here, but not over there. That one of the ways the American economy boomed was that in a time when the biggest industry in the world, the 19th century, was cotton textiles and cotton clothing, this was a country that grew the best cotton. And if you noticed that, you would have noticed that the labor that made it possible to grow cotton were black slaves. So that the nice wages of a part of the society depended on the slavery of the other part. You would have then understood that capitalism's success was extraordinarily uneven. It went to some, but not others. That's how I opened tonight, with a recovery that went to some, but not others. But here's the political punch. The time for the United States and its working class to be on the winning end of capitalism is over. It's been over for 30 years because the capitalists have moved on. They're someplace else where they can make more money, which is what drives them. And so they're moving production to India, to China, to Bangladesh, to Malaysia, to Vietnam, to Ecuador, to Panama. You get the picture. And so for the United States working class, or to be blunt, for all of you, the prospects, to use another technical term, suck. They're awful. And it's not just because you're a student, although we're sticking it to you specially, but it's for everybody. It's why the majority of Americans are not participating in this recovery. Because we're not talking about an up and down. We're talking about a long trend. Here's then a question for you politically. What will the American working class do this year, next year, the year after, as it slowly sinks in, as it is, that we are on a long turn down, that your young people are not going to live as well as we do. My whole adult life, I was a tenured professor. I taught 2 courses a semester. I made a very comfortable living. But my students can't do it. They can't find such jobs because they're being eradicated. My students are all adjuncts, hysterical people teaching 7 courses at 3 universities and spending most of their time on the subway getting from one to the other. They will never have the kind of life I did. It's over. And maybe then there will be the appreciation that capitalism is a system that works this way. And then the question will be whether it's an acceptable system. Whether the people at this end of capitalism, and who are they? The Americans, the Western Europeans, and the Japanese. The ones who rode high for a while and who are now off the gravy train. Over the last 5 years, the United States has grown on average 2%, 2.5%. The Chinese economy over the exact same period has grown an average of 8%. It's over. That's why the Chinese economy is the second economy in the world now, catching up to us literally every day. But that's not us as in Americans, because half of what comes to the United States from China is produced in subsidiaries of American corporations located in China. They relocated their business from here to there. And they're making a lot of money, which is why the rich people here who own shares in those companies are doing well, and why you aren't. That's the lesson of Bangladesh, beyond the horror of the death of all those people. And the fact that one of the fruits of that death is some of their relatives may be able to go from $38 a month to $40. Next item. Big item. Since I just finished talking about students, that's at the young end, I'm now going to talk about Social Security. That's at the other end. Social Security has been in the news a lot and is going to be in the news a lot. Why is that? Because Social Security is on the chopping block. Social Security takes a lot of money for the government to pay, and people who don't want to pay taxes figure out that the best way to avoid paying taxes is to get the government to do less so it doesn't need to raise taxes since it isn't doing what it used to do. So what better plan than to cut Social Security? So I need to go through that with you because it's going to be a big political nightmare over the next weeks and months. Plus it's going to affect you, all of you. Those of you that are older, you know exactly why. Those of you that are younger, please be aware, if Social Security does not help your elder parents and relatives, they will come to you for help. So it's going to come to you one way or another. So let's begin. When does Social Security start? 1935. We're right in the middle of the Great Depression of capitalism in the United States. But as I have told you before, and I want to just mention it again, people do not have to react to a capitalist economic downturn the way they are doing it in the United States today. How is that way? I hope it'll be better soon. I'm doing all I can to avoid it killing me. I'm so clever, I'm going to evade it. I've got a great strategy. Everything other than getting together with other people to force changes. Well, in the 1930s, Americans reacted differently. They got together with other Americans, and boy, were they successful in forcing changes. I've told you the story. The greatest wave of union organization in American history happened in the depths of the Depression. We've never had that many people join unions in a few years as we had in the depths of the Depression. We never had anything like it before, and we've never had anything like it since. Did a depression make people say, we're not going to fight? On the contrary. They joined by the millions in a matter of months. They also joined, this will come as a real shock to some of you, they joined two political parties, actually a group of political parties, one with the name Socialist, there were several socialist parties, and one with the even scarier name Communist. They joined them in large numbers all over America. Can you believe it? And they worked hand in glove with the unions, led by the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations. And in the middle of the Depression, Americans unified, organized, mobilized. And they made demands on the government. The unions made a demand to help the average person, to do for the average person in the Great Depression precisely what I began today by showing you is not being done for the average person in the current Great Recession. What did the unions demand? Well, before I tell you, I'm going to tell you what the socialists and communists said. They said, you know, capitalism stinks. We want socialism. We want a whole new system. We don't want to get a penny ante, this adjustment, that adjustment, this reform. We want a revolution. We want a big, just scared the capitalists to death. They thought that kind of thing only happened in Europe. Here it was here, which made them convinced that it was a lot of Europeans who snuck in here and were agitating people. Since everybody here, other than the Native Americans, was either European or African, they had a point. But it didn't go very far. So what did the unions, the communists, and the socialists achieve? I'm just going to give you a few. Well, the first one, Social Security. In the midst of the Depression, when unemployment was 25%, that's 3 times what it is today. 25%. When there's no money anywhere to do anything. When every government is bankrupt, there's no money, it's a great recession. We establish Social Security. And the President of the United States, Roosevelt, goes on the radio and says, I'm so happy to announce we're helping all of the people in this terrible depression because if you're 65 years of age or older, as of tomorrow, we're going to give you a check every month for the rest of your life for which you have to do nothing. What? Yes. Working class Americans were suddenly confronted by a government which gave them an enormous help in the midst of a depression. Did they do that because they were nice? No. They did that because they were scared to lose the excrement they had contained. That's a technical revision of scared shitless. Right? They were afraid of what was happening. They had never seen that in America before. And so they figured, oh, well, we better do something. So they created Social Security. And I'm going to come back and tell you about it in a minute. They also created unemployment insurance. What was that? The federal government announced, if you're unemployed, and it's not your fault, you didn't do something bad, you just lost your job because your employer had nobody to sell anything to, you were entitled to get a check every week while you were unemployed, which we had never done before. Just think, there's no money to do anything. We have Social Security for the old people, unemployment for the people without work. We're not done yet. We passed the minimum wage. We don't care how hard the economic conditions are. You got to pay at least that amount. Nice. And I'm still not done. We had a federal jobs program between 1935 and 1943. The federal government said, apparently the private enterprises are not able or willing to hire Americans, and we have millions unemployed. So if the private sector isn't able or willing, then we will do it in the government. And Roosevelt created between 8.5 and 12, depending on how you count, million jobs, which he gave to unemployed people, who therefore had a good feeling about themselves, could make their mortgage payments. By the way, many of the national parks that you visit in the West, they were built by those unemployed people. Some of the first ecological reclamations of swampy areas and so forth were done by those people. The WPA gave jobs to artists around the country, actors, painters, sculptors, to deal with unemployment in a creative way. Just imagine. All the things we do not have today, they had in the United States in the 1930s, about which there is a collective national amnesia. Neither the Republicans nor Democrats ever talk about it. President Obama doesn't say boo. How often has he proposed a federal jobs program? Try zero. Nothing. It's as if by saying nothing about it, we can hope that the American people never learn about any of this and do not have these ideas. So let's go to Social Security. Here's how it was set up. It's called a pay-as-you-go system. Here's what it means. We're going to take a little bit of money from everybody's check, weekly paycheck. That's how it was set up. We're going to take a little bit. And we're only going to take it on the first, I don't know what the initial one was, say $3,000 or $4,000. So if you make more, don't worry. We're just going to tax the first $3,000 or $4,000, this rate, and that will bring money in, and that's the money we'll use to take care of the people over 65. That's what it means, a pay-as-you-go system. You bring money in from the people working now, and you use it to take care of the people eligible because they're now over 65. And that's how it was done from 1935 through the 40s, through the 50s, through the 60s. Notice, worked a long time. Then in the 1980s, something interesting happened. The government, never quite explaining what they were doing, came up with a wonderful idea. We're going to raise the rates, and we're going to raise the amount of money on your income that we apply the rates to. So instead of the Social Security tax being just on the first $3,000 or $4,000, it was raised to the first $10,000, the first $30,000. What is it today? $113,000. The first $113,000 you earn, you got to pay the Social Security tax. On everything above $113,000, the Social Security tax is zero. We only apply Social Security tax to wage and salary income, and only up to the first 113. So if you're a bank president who earns $400,000, you pay your Social Security on the first 113, but on the other 300,000, no tax at all. That's called a regressive tax, because the richer you are, the smaller the percentage of your total income goes for this tax. Since the richer you are, the bigger the portion of your income that pays no such tax. But it gets better. The tax only applies to wages and salaries. If you have dividends from stocks, do you pay a Social Security tax on them? Nothing, nada, not on the first dollar, on no dollar. Do you have interest income from your bonds? You pay any Social Security tax on that? No. You have rent on land? No. In other words, if you're a rich person who has property, stocks, bonds, land, you don't pay Social Security tax. That's the tax that we only apply to those of you that are poor. That's who we give it to. But it's better still. It's better still. I'm not done. I'm sorry. I wish I had a different story to tell you. But if you want a different story, there's no shortage. Just turn on the TV, and everything will be really fine. Listen to the economic news they present, and you will feel much, much better. Okay? But I assume that's why you came. So I'm going to continue. In the 1980s, they raised the amount of our incomes that we had to pay the Social Security tax on, and they raised the rate of taxation. They raised it here we go now. If you understand this, you'll understand what's going on. They raised it way more than was necessary to raise the money to take care of all the eligible people over 65. How much more? I'm going to tell you now. Today, as of today, by $3 trillion with a T, $3 trillion was taken out of the wages and salaries of American working people with a regressive tax, one that falls mostly on the poor. And that, what was done with that money? You didn't pay it out to the people over 65. There weren't anyone there. Well, you took care of all the eligible ones with much less money. So what did you do with the extra money? The Social Security set up the Social Security trust funds. Sounds nice, doesn't it? There they are, the trust funds, accumulating hundreds of billions, and now, as I say, $3 trillion. Now, here we go. What did the trust funds do with all of the money taxed from wages and salaries and nobody else, and just the bottom? Ready? They lent it to the United States government. The whole $3 trillion was lent to the U.S. Treasury. Now, try to understand what I'm about to explain. That meant the United States Treasury didn't have to tax corporations for that money. It didn't have to tax individuals. And that's interesting, because the corporations didn't want to pay taxes. And the rich people didn't want to pay taxes. And the personal income tax in this country is a progressive tax, one where the percentage you have to pay goes up as your income is higher. So progressive income tax didn't have to come up with that money, the $3 trillion. That's a lot of money. And corporations didn't have to. And you know why? Because wage and salary earners at the bottom of this society, they had to pay it. And so we lent it to the government, and the government used it for all of its normal functions, including wonderful things like the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, for example. That was paid for, all of these things, by this excessive taxation of the middle and lower income classes in this country. So then over the last 20 years, the Social Security system had two kinds of income. It kept collecting taxes from working people's wages and salaries, but it also got interest on the money it lent to the government. So now we come to the present. America is changing. The average age of Americans is getting older and older, so that the number of people becoming eligible for Social Security is rising. And so we have to give them more money. And we don't have that many people working. You know why? Because our capitalists are employing people in Bangladesh for $38 a month and saying to the American worker, have a nice day. And the American worker's unemployed. And the American worker's getting lower wages, which means he's contributing less to Social Security. So there's less coming in and more going out. But it's okay for a while. By the way, for how long? Until 2020, 7 years from now. At that point, Social Security will have more money to pay out to people than it is getting either from people paying in or from interest on what it lent to the government. At that point, what happens 7 years from now? The Social Security system will have to go to the United States Treasury and say, the only way we can make good on the commitments we've made to the American people to give them a Social Security benefit when they're 65 years of age or older is if you, the United States Treasury, come up with the money. You got to start paying us back the $3 trillion taken in excess from middle and lower income people through the Social Security system. The conservatives, the business, and the rich in America see this coming. They don't want to pay. And they're fully aware that the mass of the American people will not, because they cannot pay. Therefore, the solution for them is as the Republican Party demands, cut Social Security. Say to the millions of Americans who've put their money in there all their life, have a nice day. You're never going to see it again. It's not coming. On January 1st of this year, Republicans and Democrats who can't agree on anything agreed to increase the tax for Social Security. It went up for everybody, January 1. And last month, Mr. Obama announced that he's willing to put Social Security on the table in his bargains with the Republican Party to talk about cuts. So let me do that again. The beginning of this year, we all pay more in, and 3 months into the year, we're told they're going to give us less out. At this point, as often happens in my talks, if I had a moment, I would stop and we would have a few bars of the national anthem. Because there's something stunningly American in this systematic fleecing of the people. It's extraordinary. And that there aren't people in the street, old ones who face this problem right now, and the young ones who are going to be impacted by the fact that their older friends and relatives are going to be in trouble, is an amazing testimony to the capacity of the media, of the educational system of this society, to keep you fuzzed up in your mind about this, not aware of what's going on. This isn't that complicated. It really isn't. You've been hustled. You've been hustled so many ways for so long, and you don't even see it anymore. And I think many of you, if you're honest with yourselves, you'll know you're complicit in not seeing it. Because who would want to see this, after all? For some of you, once a month with me is about the maximum you can take. Right? You kind of come because a part of you wants to know, but another part of you says, whoo, Jeopardy would be more relaxing. Or something like that. But if you don't pay attention and if you don't change it, you're talking about a very grim set of prospects for what we all face in the years ahead. Okay, I have time for one more. I want to talk to you about a perennial topic that is also extremely important, and that is the economics of health and health care in the United States. And here I'm relying, by the way, I can give you all the references for all the other stuff if you're interested, but here I'm relying on the work of a fellow professor of mine up at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, who has devoted the last 10 years of his life to studying this. His name is Gerald Friedman. I don't know if any of you have come across him, but he's a remarkable researcher, and so I'm using his work here. Okay. How do we handle healthcare in the United States? Well, we handle it through private capitalist enterprises. That's how we've organized it. By the way, in many other countries, much of the healthcare system is not organized that way. So, for example, in other countries, like in ours, it's believed that in a city, you ought to have a park, or maybe even more than one. A nice park, you know, with trees and grass and swans on the pond and all of that, like we have in Central Park or Prospect Park or anywhere else. And it is thought in those countries, like in ours, that you oughtn't to make that a capitalist enterprise. For example, if you had a capitalist enterprise, to put your blanket on the lawn over there would be $82 an hour. Whereas if you put it over there, where there's some smelly cabbage, it's only $20. And you could see which neighborhoods sent their people to what part of the park, and which neighborhoods sent their people to the other part. You get the picture? $4 you could drink at the fountain, $6 you could drink twice at the fountain, so forth. If you had enough money, you would get to feed bread to the swan. If you didn't, you got to push bread at a dead pigeon. Right? Whatever. However, a capitalist enterprise would see a way to make money. We don't do that. We make a park, and we produce it. We pay a lot of money through our taxes and so on to make that park nice and clean and put flowers in it and have the benches repaired and all the things to make it a nice thing, right? We do that. We think that's reasonable. And if someone came in and said, no, I'm a private enterprise, I'm going to convert it into Coney Island, there'd be some objection. Well, there are other societies, this is strange, there are other societies who think healthcare ought to be run like a park. You ought to have a nice system, and it should be available to everybody, and it should be maintained by the general fund, because taking care of people's health is at least as important as providing them a place to have too much beer on a picnic. Okay, that makes sense to people. But we don't. We make it a private capitalist industry, or to be more accurate, 4 industries. The doctors, set up now as corporations. The hospitals, set up as corporations. The drug companies and device producers, set up as corporations. And finally, the insurers of our health, the 4 big industries. Okay. Other countries don't work it like that. And I'm going to use an example, because Professor Friedman does it very nicely. I'm going to use an example of our neighbor to the north, Canada. Country in many ways like us, as you know. What was the name of that vice president who took an airplane ride? Forget his name. What was his name? Quayle. Yes, Quayle. He was that famous vice president a million years ago who went on a trip to Canada, got off the airplane, and in the full glare of the TV lights said how happy he was to land in, I think it was Ottawa. He said, it's almost like being in another country. But intelligence or education has never been a requirement for our highest officials, as they show us all the time. Anyway, before 1971, Canada's medical care system was like ours. And in 1971 is when Canada created their, what they call a single-payer, government-funded healthcare system. Before that, Canada spent a larger share of its income for medical care than the United States did. That was one of the reasons that Canada converted to a publicly funded single payer. The government runs the healthcare system of the country, the insurance system particularly. Okay, here we are 40 years later. What's the situation? The United States now spends over $3,000 more per person per year for healthcare than the people of Canada. That means for a family of 4, $12,000 more is spent on average by the American family for its health care than the Canadian family of 4 spends. In other words, they went to a publicly supported, government-run health care system, and they saved a bundle. Here's the reality. The United States, as a nation, spends more on health care than any other advanced industrial country. Nobody else comes close. I believe the numbers are we spend more than twice the amount per family that number 2 in the ranking spends. So you have a stunning reality. Our private capitalist system delivers the most expensive health care on the planet. Are the results of our healthcare system the best in the world? Not even close. There are a dozen countries who have longer lifespan than we do. There are 20 countries that have lower infant mortality than we do. All the basic measures used by public health authorities around the world indicate that the United States' results are what would honestly be called middle of the road, mediocre, okay, nothing special. We spend more than anybody, and we get nothing special. In the laws of economics, this is not supposed to work out. If you charge more than everybody else, and you deliver a mediocre example of what other people will sell for half the price, a consumer who isn't the moron will stop shopping in your place, because they can do better elsewhere. The only reason the moron wouldn't do that is if you held a gun to his head and said, you can't go anywhere else. Enter the United States. You live here, you got two choices. Play the game of this medical system or drop dead. This is your choice. It's a free country. It's your choice. No gun. No gun. As you know, Americans don't have anything to do with guns. So, no gun. You're free. You're free. Let me give you an idea of the explanation for this. And some of the statistics here are so stunning, I wanted to read them to you so you could think about them. The average physician in the United States now spends 4 times as much interacting with insurance companies as does the average physician in Ontario, Canada. Over $80,000 per physician, compared with a little over $20,000 in Ontario. Prescription drug prices and administrative expenses have been the fastest rising costs in the United States healthcare system. From 1980 to 2005, administrative costs rose by 1,300%, while drug prices rose by nearly 2,000%. Final sentence of this section. And read this and think. There are now 2.5 million administrative support personnel in the American healthcare system, more than the number of nurses and 5 times the number of physicians. We now have more healthcare managers than physicians and surgeons. Rising costs drive up health insurance premiums so that a family health insurance plan now costs about 40% of the average family wage. In 1960, the same health plan for a family of 4 cost 7% of their annual income. The story here is really quite simple, that the real folks that have done it to us have been the drug companies jacking up the prices into the stratosphere, and the insurance companies and then the doctors and the hospitals, as they have had to employ an army of people to keep the records and to manage denying you coverage for the tooth that turns out to have maybe been chipped when you were 11 and therefore does not entitle you to get it fixed now. Or the disease which is not quite described by those systems, and therefore if 6 doctors, 12 managers, and 3 clerks work enough time on the paperwork, we can screw you out of half what the doctor charged you. And that the doctor has to have 4 people to get the insurance company to get the doctor the pay that the doctor's supposed to get from having treated on and on and on. We pay an army of people. And how is that possible? Because the drug companies, the doctors, the hospitals, and the insurers long ago understood if they fight with each other, the mass of consumers will be the winners. If they get together, they will win, and we will pay for it. The story is the victory of the latter. So we hear endless stories about the unfortunate socialized medicine in Canada. They pay half what we do and have better medical outcomes than we do, and that's true for most of the countries in Western Europe as well. The OECD, the International Health Organization, all of them show this. What an amazing story. Once again, you see a particular way of organizing an enterprise, and in this case, 4 industries getting together to be able to gouge out of the United States' economy a place for itself to get twice the amount of the GDP, the total output, twice the amount of money spent that the same industries get in all the other advanced industrial countries. We don't get better results, we just pay much more. And we permit it. And we watch it, and we grumble over it, and we accept it. The Canadians didn't, and they're not going back. Every government, conservative government in Europe that I know of, has tried at one point or another to undo their nationalized health systems, and they've always lost. Even in England, which tries so hard to be like the United States. They couldn't do it. The National Health Service there has survived even the current government of Mr. Cameron. It is a remarkable story. Is there a kind of final punchline? I think so. I think whether we start with the uneven recovery that I began with, if we look at the crisis being imposed on young people going to college, the absurd tragedy of those dead people in Bangladesh, having to go through a 19th century kind of primitive capitalism to feed into the profit drive of American and European and Japanese corporations who see money to be made by the desperate conditions of Bangladesh and leaving in the lurch the Detroits of the world who can look back in vague glory to their times 40 years ago when they were still important to the same capitalists that have moved on. It really is a description with the health and so forth and the Social Security of a system that has spun out of control. Well, really the only question that remains, how far can it go at your expense before you finally say, this is crazy? Do you have to be dropped out of school because you can't pay the bills? Do you have to be going to the local Walmart when there's a sale on cat food to take care of your grandmother? What? What is going to be necessary? What level? When will Americans begin to say, this really isn't just my problem, my family, my neighborhood, my job. This is something happening to almost everybody, and you can't keep being excited about all the things that distract you from this as this situation unravels. It really is the political, but also the economic punchline. None of this has to be this way. The recovery doesn't have to look like that. It could look like what we had in the 1930s, or it could be better still. Final point to prove that it could be different, that there are alternatives. Not T-I-N-A, there is no alternative, but T-I-A-A, there is an alternative. And here's how we'll do it, just as a finisher. According to the Federal Reserve here in the United States, we have 20% unused capacity in the United States. That is 20% of the tools, equipment, machines, office space, factory space, store space is sitting idle and empty. It's there, we're just making no use of it. And according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics and Department of Labor that keeps these records, we have about 20% of the American working class not working, either unemployed or discouraged, not even looking, or underemployed or whatever. Wow. 20% of the people looking for work, conveniently, 20% of the tools, equipment, and raw materials they need to work with and on are available. Well, let's see, what would that be worth? Well, we can do a little calculation. We had 80% of the equipment being used last year, and 80% of the people working. And our GDP, our total output of goods and services, $15 trillion. So another 20%, we're talking $3 or $4 trillion. $3 or $4 trillion could be produced in the United States if we put, do you know what that would do for the poverty of the world? That's many, many times, in 1 year, many, many times what the United Nations has set out for the next 20 years to eradicate poverty is much less money than we could produce in 1 year of full employment. We wouldn't need fire traps collapsing in Bangladesh. We'd give 20% of Americans what they want, a job. We would use 20% of the tools, equipment, and raw materials that are just gathering rust and dust anyway. And we produce an output that could transform the lives of the world. Then the United States might be able to begin and end its political speeches by saying something like, this is the greatest country in the world. Otherwise, it's a cruel mockery of something that's fast becoming the opposite. Thank you very much.